Rejected, throwing away, affected. I don't know what to say. Ejected, cast out to the sea, disconnected. They didn't want me.
Hello everyone, welcome to a brand new episode of Nicksmissal III. I am Patricia, and I'm here with Admin James.
I'm here!
So today, we're going to be discussing about another Nicktoon that would have had a theatrical movie, but was eventually cancelled. Today, we're going to be discussing about the 1996 Nicktoon KaBlam. And believe it or not, Nickelodeon was planning on releasing a theatrical movie based off one of KaBlam's shorts. It was going to be about Prometheus and Bob.
Oh, I think you mean Phineas and Ferb.
I hate you. Anyway, so this is the third time that we've talked about KaBlam in Nicksmissal. I don't know why, but it just seems that KaBlam tried so hard to branch out itself with releasing numerous projects, but they've never came out. So, if you want, you can check out the annotations right here. Click on the first one to check out our discussion of the rejected pilot Stewie the Dog Boy, and check out over here on our second annotation where we discussed about Angela Anaconda. That was a KaBlam short that eventually moved over to Fox. Alright, so, Prometheus and Bob. For those who don't know what KaBlam is, because it is one of the least talked about Nicktoons that aired in the 90s, it's about these two kids named Henry and June who live in a comic book, and they run a show called KaBlam where they tell a whole bunch of jokes, and they feature a lot of cartoon skits. And each cartoon skit is based off of different styles of animation. You have Sniz and Fondue, Action League Now, Life with Loopy, Prometheus and Bob. Prometheus and Bob, the story of that is that it's about an alien who traveled 100,000 years ago in the past. Along the way, he finds a caveman, and he wants to train him, and he records everything on tape. And then, of course, you have all these gags involving with Bob's monkey, who ruins everything. Prometheus and Bob is one of the least talked about skits that I can recall because everybody was getting into Action League Now. Because, it was a parody of superheroes and stuff like that, and eventually Action League Now did get its own spin-off series. But it seems like nowadays, more people discuss about Prometheus and Bob than any other of the KaBlam skits. What do you think that is?
Probably because, in my opinion, it actually stands out more than the other skits do. It was the most memorable, and people remember it fondly because I feel like it was actually the funniest.
Interesting, because I don't remember anybody talking about Prometheus and Bob when I was a kid. Everybody was talking about Action League Now. But personally, in my opinion, my favorite has always been Life with Loopy. Because to me, that felt like what Pete and Pete would have been like if it was animated. But
I feel bad about that because I don't feel I did my research.
That's okay. But yeah, it's very interesting because, it's kind of like one of those things in which, even though KaBlam was like one of the least talked about Nicktoons of the 90s, it has a bit of a cult following, and out of all of them, Prometheus and Bob has stand out as like the most memorable skit for a lot of people who grew up with the show, as opposed to Action League Now, in which that was the most popular one of the 90s. But anyway, there was supposed to be a Prometheus and Bob movie that would have came out in the late 90s. And I remember distinctly talking about this at Nick 35 Part 3. When I was doing research about all the Nickelodeon shows that were rejected, I found out about Stewie the Dog Boy, and then I read an article dating back to the late 90s discussing about that they were going to make a Prometheus and Bob movie. And I was like, really? They were going to make a movie off of this? And I read into it, I wanted to learn more, so I got in contact with the person who wrote the script of the movie, Joe Stillman. For those who don't know, Joe Stillman, he was a writer for KaBlam. He also was one of the many writers on The Adventures of Pete and Pete, and he would become a story editor for various shows, even still to this day. He worked alongside with writing stories and story editing for Sanjay and Craig, which makes a lot of sense because Will McRobb and Chris Viscardi also worked on that show. But yeah, I wrote to Joe and see if maybe he can shed some more light into what this story would have been about. Anyway, so let me read to you what he told me. Wow, I wrote that script a long time ago. Don't remember much of the story except that I liked it a lot. Amy Heckerling was the executive producer and hired me to write it. I recall that the script came out well, and Nickelodeon was very enthused about it. There was a creative executive at Nickelodeon who was behind the project and proposed excellent actors, but eventually it never took off. I think it was still an early time for Nickelodeon Studios. And then I wrote to him other things. I've told him about who would have been the actors portrayed in Prometheus and Bob. And he said, there would have been 2 actors that would have been portrayed in Prometheus and Bob that were excellent, which, trust me, I'll get to who they were going to choose in a minute. It was going to be an origin story, and I think that's the short that Amy Heckerling had chosen because she seemed it was ripe for a good feature-length story. So yes, Prometheus and Bob the movie would have been a prequel. It would have taken place like around the time when Prometheus was deciding to go back in time to planet Earth to train Bob. So it would have been about when Prometheus and Bob met for the very first time. And this would have been, get this, this movie would have not been a stop-motion movie. This would have been a live-action movie.
Wow.
No, it gets better. The main cast choice that they wanted to choose for Prometheus and Bob were Chris Farley and David Spade.
Really?
I'm not even joking. They considered Prometheus was going to be played by David Spade and Bob was going to be played by Chris Farley. I am not joking.
SNL veterans would have been involved with this movie. Wow. Yes. To be honest with you, I actually think that it would have been interesting to see. It would have been interesting to see this movie get made, but it's sad that it basically got put on the back burner.
Okay, so yeah, this would have been interesting because around the late 90s, after Chris Farley and David Spade left SNL, they were everywhere. They basically performed various, skits together. They were in, the movies such as Black Sheep and Tommy Boy. So yeah, these two were hugely popular. They were at the height of their career. Later on, Chris Farley was casted to be the original voice of Shrek. But unfortunately, in 1997, that was when Chris Farley died of a drug overdose. So maybe that was one of the reasons.
Which is sad. It really is.
Yeah, it is very sad.
He was a legend.
Yeah, definitely. Have you seen that Chris Farley documentary yet?
I don't think I have, but I'm looking forward to actually seeing it.
You should see it because it is so hilarious, yet it is so sad. Like, Chris Farley was like a hilarious comedian, but at the same time, he always felt doubtful to himself. That's why he was so depressed all the time. He felt like he could do so much better, but he just felt like he was letting everybody down, which is why he got into drugs and alcohol, which is a shame, really.
That's heartbreaking because, in all honesty, he didn't let people down. He was one of the biggest comedy actors in the 90s.
Yeah, I know, but that's what depression does to you. It fills you up with so many doubtful things that it blocks away from everybody who's saying a bunch of positive things to you. But yeah, maybe that was one of the reasons why the movie got sidelined because of Chris Farley's passing, but yeah, interesting choice that they wanted to do this live action because probably would have been more like an SNL movie if they would have had Chris Farley and David Spade, but in my opinion, I think this would have probably generated towards a bigger audience because, hey, it has Chris Farley and David Spade in it. Let's go watch it because, KaBlam wasn't like that well known. I mean, not even Prometheus and Bob at the time. So maybe it would have generated more viewers to go watch this. I mean, here's the question. What would have happened if this movie came out? This is probably just one of the most interesting Nickelodeon movies that was conceived.
I agree. You know something? I really would have loved to see this movie get made. And it's a shame that it didn't because basically Prometheus and Bob were some of my favourite skits on the entire show. And I think that the premise sounded wonderful.
There's always been a massive question that even back then when I first heard about this movie, it's like, how would this movie have been perceived? Because if you remember Prometheus and Bob, there was little to no talking in the skits. So when bringing it into the big screen, with live-action characters, and they're very well known for bantering each other with dialogue as well as physical humor. I mean, maybe by Prometheus and Bob standards, maybe it would have just said, you know what, screw it, let's just have Chris Farley and David Spade do whatever, but it would have taken away what made Prometheus and Bob so charming. It's like, you've relied a lot on less dialogue and more of the, physical action, which Chris Farley would have done an amazing job because he's a very physical actor. David Spade is more dialogue than anything, so, I mean, Prometheus did speak a little bit, but more in garbled talk. Bob mostly grunted, so I don't know. I don't know how this movie would have done because, either you have to make a movie similar to the skits in which there was no talking and there was a lot more acting with physical moves, or you just scratch that all together and just have it talking and that's it. And it's like, do you think that kids would have been ready for something like that? Because, kids back then were used to watching, a lot of action and movement and funny jokes and stuff like that. So, I don't know if kids would have been incredibly bored
Probably
by it.
not at the time, but if it came out later, I think it probably would do.
Yeah, and again, similar to Our Real Monsters, this was a Nicktoon that didn't really receive as much popularity. 1998, you still had Rugrats, you had Cat Dog, you had the Wild Thornberrys. So, KaBlam was just one of those cartoons that was kind of like, I'll watch it when it's on. And that was pretty much it. So, the fact that they wanted to put in a lot of money and a big budget to this movie, it's interesting. And, yeah, unfortunately, we don't know anything besides what Joe, told me. In fact, I don't think a lot of people even know about this movie before we started talking about it. Unless you're a hardcore Nick fan. But how do you think this would have changed in the line of cinema?
I'm not sure. I think probably more movies would have probably tried to copy its direction.
Yeah, maybe it would have. Maybe it would have been one of those movies that was, like, heavily misunderstood. Like, what is this movie? Why are Chris Farley and David Spade an alien and a caveman? Like, remember that David Spade and Chris Farley, the two movies that they were in were, like, PG-13 rated R movies. So, I don't know if they, like, had this mass appeal to kids. Later on, David Spade would be in the Rugrats movie, and Chris Farley would appear in all that. So I guess kids would kind of know who, Chris Farley and David Spade were at the time. But, I think for, like, the general audience, I think they would have been confused.
Me too. I think it would have probably been one of those movies that would be probably popular at the time, but I think it would probably get riffed on these days by people like the Nostalgia Critic.
Yeah, I think so too. But, I'm not dissing on what the story would have been. I think the story for fans, it would have been great, but yeah, I think this is just one of the most strangest concepts ever, but I would have loved to have seen this movie get made. But, again, similar to what I said about, like, Are You Afraid of the Dark and Our Real Monsters, I don't think it would have come out at the right time, because KaBlam was not in its popularity. Chris Farley and David Spade, they probably would have stuck out like a sore thumb, performing as these characters for, like, children, when they were really known for generating towards teenagers and adults. And, yeah, it would have came out in the late 90s, so I don't know if, these kind of movies, the kind of movies that kids were watching, like the animated movies, it probably would have just stuck out like a sore thumb. I think it was just one of those cases in which I understand why they rejected this movie, because, it probably wouldn't have followed on what what the Prometheus and Bob shorts were on KaBlam, because, they had to talk. That's what David Spade and Chris Farley were known. They were known for bantering with one another. So it would have lost the charm of the shorts, but at the same time, you just want to see what this would have been like.
It probably wouldn't have been perfect, but I would have loved to see it out of curiosity to see how it would pan out.
Maybe it would have, like, gotten KaBlam more recognition than it does now. Maybe there would have been more live-action, there would have been more live-action movies based off of animated shows, which, I just thought of it. Remember, like, back in the 90s when they were trying to redo those old shows from, like, the 60s, like, Addams Family and Dennis the Menace? I just remembered, the late 90s, they had that Flintstones cartoon. That Flintstones movie. I'm sorry, the Flintstones movie.
Oh, yeah, I remember that.
Yeah, so I guess I kind of, here's the thing. I mean, the movie may be a train wreck, but at least it followed I think it followed what the style of the Flintstones was, but it wasn't that interesting, and it wasn't good, but I mean, maybe the Prometheus and Bob movie would have gone in that direction, in which, unless you're a really hardcore Prometheus and Bob fan, you would just look at this movie and you're wondering, like, what is going on? Why are Chris Farley and David Spade portrayed as these weird characters? And, maybe it would have been, like, based off of the popular cartoon KaBlam, but KaBlam was not a popular cartoon in its time, and even still to this day, it's not even talked as well regarded as, say, like, Rugrats or Hey Arnold or SpongeBob.
I blame this largely on the rights, issues, whereas Rugrats has been re-aired since its second ending.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, KaBlam still to this day has a lot of legal issues. Like, the opening theme song of KaBlam is the song Two-Tone Army, and they featured a lot of music videos back in the day. Like, there are songs from They Might Be Giants, and a whole bunch of other bands. So that is why they can't release it, because of copyright issues. Same reason why they can't release shows such as Wienerville, or Roundhouse, or The Adventures of Pete and Pete. Because they feature songs that could, that could be a violation of copyright claims.
Exactly. So, unfortunately, as good as the show is, it hasn't really been vindicated in the sense of nostalgia like the other shows have.
Yeah, exactly. And I've seen a lot of, like, top 10 Nicktoons of the 90s, and I always see KaBlam at the bottom of the list.
It's a shame, because I feel like it deserves more love.
Yeah, I do agree. Alright, so any final words to say about this movie right before we go?
It would have been interesting to see it made back in the day, but I don't feel that it would actually hold up in 2016.
This movie would have been an interesting experiment, but I don't know if it would have panned out toward the general audience. I mean, for people who liked KaBlam, it would have been jarred. It most likely would have been, like, really jarred away from the original charm because of David Spade and Chris Farley. But then people who are the general audience will probably just be confused, because Chris Farley is a caveman who just grunts, and David Spade is an alien who just mumbles. So it's like, what is this? Why am I not watching Tommy Boy? So yeah, it would have been a mess for both audience members. Alright, well, that's it for this episode. Tune in next time as we're discussing about a movie that would have been based off of a very well-known graphic novel. See you next time.
Let's not forget that Nickelodeon is planning to reboot your life. So you'll relive your childhood memories. This time in glorious CGI.
So why?